Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. Welcome you all today on this International Women's Day and Holi, which is the Indian first day of spring. We never had winter here in New York, so I'm excited for spring, I guess. But also even more excited today to welcome Sean Jacobs, Associate Professor of International Affairs at the New School, who is the founder and editor of Africa is a Country, and who I've been really wanting to speak to because we've been hearing so much coverage about the Nigerian elections. Some of us may have read about Jill Biden's visit to Africa, and I think it's really important for us today to look at how Africa connects to us here at the Doorstep. So many different countries and different priorities, and we're going to get to them today. And again, happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sean, on this International Women's Day, which I love personally. And I think there's so much to talk about on what's happening across Africa in terms of women's rights. One of the things we'll be talking about later this month is feminist foreign policy. And I was reading about in Africa, and the African Union has adopted a gender strategy that women are more represented in politics than they were a few years ago across the continent. And I'd like to start there and then move on to the great youth movements across Africa, because these are the two powerful forces that I think are going to be transformative over the next decade. And I'm so excited to have you here to talk us through what this means, not only across the continent, but also what this means for us back home here in the US, and why we need to pay more attention to Africa. And before I throw that pitch to you, I want to say that Jill Biden recently went to Africa, and it was beautiful. There was a beautiful story in the Post and talking about how across the continent, everybody knew that Jill Biden was there, and there was so much media coverage. And guess how much media coverage was here in the US? Nothing. And the headline that I read that really bothered me the most from the Post: when Jill Biden went to Africa, her comment about 2024 stole all the attention. Why? Why is that? Let's change the narrative today with you and talk about what I think Jill Biden was really there to do also, was to support women and all of the activity around micro-lending and women's rights that is happening right now. And on this International Women's Day, let's talk more about that.
I mean, I don't know how, well, let me start by saying this. I'm not mad that Americans wanted to ask her, is your husband running for president? Because that's the big question here, right? I think he's 80 years old. And I think somebody said by the time he'll be inaugurated, he'll be 82. I may have seen that from the Washington Post article, actually. So I understand why that's the story. And that's not unusual. That always happens if an American president is traveling somewhere. The US press corps that travels with him, they're asking him about domestic politics. And I think the people in the room are not American. Obviously, you look and, if you're a journalist or an observer in the country that the president or the first lady or second lady is visiting, I think you are sort of wondering like, hey, you're in our home, talk about us. So I do understand that. I'm not going to entirely hate on that. It's my first response. At the same time, I do think it's interesting. So there's that. There's also, I don't want to also be naive. Obviously, Joe Biden had that big summit in December in Washington. He did make it clear that a number of senior people from his administration would be visiting the continent. I think the trade secretary was just in South Africa to talk to South Africa about renewable energy. Now I think he said at least eight people would go. And so now Jill Biden's gone. And the context, of course, is two things. One is he's aware, the US is aware of China's growing influence, and they're trying to counter that. That was what that summit was all about. And secondly, there's a war going on in Ukraine that is having a direct effect in Africa on food supply, people's access, countries' access to energy supply, oil, etc. So there is, and I think Joe Biden actually, while he was in Europe, sort of said, Jill's going there to say something. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was a reference to rebuking Putin and that some African countries are supporting Russia. So I don't want to be naive, that's also happening. So it's definitely geopolitics. And I think Joe Biden is kind of an emissary of Joe Biden in trying to convince Africans who at this point, I don't think it's necessarily ideological. I think it's just pure strategic politics. Why should we get involved in the war in Ukraine if we need to secure, whether it's energy, as I said, or food supplies from Russia? I don't think we need a war. Like, there's an element of that going on. But to get to your point, obviously there are major problems on the African continent. Patriarchy. There are questions around gender violence. I think Jill Biden spent some of the efforts in Namibia, because she first visited Namibia, then she visited Kenya, and she gave a number of speeches where I think she made that explicit, to talk about gender violence, to talk about empowerment. And I think she mentioned at some point that the U.S. is one of the major donors in the Horn of Africa, where there's also a food crisis. So yes, obviously, we would like for the trip during International Women's Month to be framed in that way. But unfortunately, you can't. And of course, women are also affected by these kind of larger questions around, the war in Ukraine, sort of there's the kind of values that I think China also wants to spread through its institutes. It's built these institutes in many of these countries. It supports broadcast television, the CCTV, which is now known as CGTN. I think they have a bureau in Nairobi. I don't know if one of the major American networks, or even the equivalent of a public network, or what people call public diplomacy network. The American one, VOA, I don't think it has even a massive bureau like the one that the Chinese have in Nairobi. So there's a lot at play in these visits, which on the face of it seems to be about one thing, but I think there's always something else going on.
Well, I want to pick up on some of the points that you raised there, and tying it in as well with the emergence of new leaders, next generation leaders across the continent. And that is, as we've seen over the last few weeks, there is a real growing move for African leaders to be much more frank in their discussions particularly with Europeans coming in, raising the colonial past, of saying that you the West are only interested. You're only interested now because China is here, and if China wasn't here, you wouldn't be interested. And so on and so forth. But is there a sense that you're getting as you're looking that new leaders are emerging across the continent, and that they're prepared to sort of reposition the relationship that the continent has with the West, to try to change the basis from in the past, where there's been a sense that leaders have come asking for aid, asking for development, and now it's more, we want to be partners, and if you're not going to partner with us, we have new options with China, with India, and with other parts of the rising global South. So is there a sense that maybe we're at a fork in the road where perhaps the older ways that the U.S. has had in dealing with the continent may be changing because of generational change in leadership, the role of China, the emergence of new political forces across the continent?
So again, I think it's a complicated answer. There's a simple and there's a complicated answer. So my complicated answer would be, I would argue that there is interesting political developments outside of, say, like the state, outside of power. So if what people might refer to as civil society. So I think Tatiana mentioned like young people, like the youth. So you'll see interesting developments in social movements, the NSARS, and I know we'll talk about Nigeria, but NSARS in Nigeria, which was specifically about police brutality by a kind of a unit of the police that set out to criminalize, target young people. just for like having dreadlocks or something, you know, and then torturing people. In South Africa, you had Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, which started on university campuses and seemed to be about, scrapping free public higher education. And specifically in South Africa, monuments, curriculums that in the words of the students, were just perpetuating white supremacy. So mostly like outside the state, you know, we can talk about the Arab Spring. Outside the state, I think there are these interesting political movements where people are demanding something else. They're demanding a different relationship with the West. And just one other quick point, the one place where probably explicitly that's being sort of articulated is around restitution of art, which sounds obscure and doesn't feel like it has anything to do with regular people, because it's about museums and it's about negotiating with, sometimes with European governments, because France in the end released a report saying, we will now release all this art. In the end, as we learned, they didn't do much. But in any case, this debate is out there. So what may seem like an obscure debate is actually about much more. This is about, kind of a new autonomy of Africans wanting to govern our own resources in their language on our own terms. I remember there's a quote I saw where somebody said, an art curator said, if they return our art, we don't want any conditions. If I want to burn it, I want to burn it. If I want to bury it, I want to bury it. And I think like there's a little bit of that, but I think that's outside. That's a little bit outside this. I did see a press conference in the last week where Felix Tshisekedi, who's the president of the DRC, kind of this is going viral, and he's sort of turning towards Macron and saying, stop lecturing us. And Macron said, well, I think he said, oh, that some people did it on social media. And he said, no, that's your foreign minister. So yes, there's that kind of confrontation on camera in public. But when I say I think it's a complex answer, I'm not going to be too optimistic, is we've gone through this kind of moment before of this, like, there's going to be this new class of leader. They're going to be different. I mean, I don't have to remind you, there was Meles Zenawi, Museveni. This was like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had this whole thing about all these new people are going to come in. It turns out they were all authoritarians, interestingly. Mandela was old, so they didn't see Mandela as like a new leader, although it was a completely new country. And South Africa at that time actually had a different kind of foreign policy. That was, I would say, one of the best at that time in the world. Remember, Mandela went after the then president of Nigeria, Abacha, and they weren't allowed at the Commonwealth meetings. They couldn't play in sports tournaments. So, but South Africa wasn't, I don't think South Africa at that point had that. People looked at South Africa that way. Instead, it was Meles, it was, as I said, it was Museveni and a few others, Obasanjo, and these people were all authoritarians. If you go to Africa, if you speak to young Africans now, there's a lot of admiration for like Paul Kagame, who's like basically an authoritarian. Some people might call him a neoliberal authoritarian, and it's because people look at it and go, he's offering internet. There's no, the streets are clean, it's efficient. So there's these kind of, and in that way, that's when you say like, and I don't think Kagame is necessarily close to China, but that's where that sort of the Chinese model that's authoritarian, but that delivers is seem to be more attractive to people. So I'm not, and I want to say one other quick thing. Peter Obi, who is this candidate in Nigeria that just ran, he was presented, it was like the young people coming out of NSARS, it's their political hopes to him as an outsider. But if you look closely at him also, until recently, he was the vice presidential candidate in the last election with Atiku Abubakar, who was also who's a businessman, but he was the vice president of Obasanjo. And then Peter Obi actually ran on that party ticket. He was gonna run on that party ticket again, didn't get it. So he went to another political party and became their candidate. And he's also in the Pandora Papers. So what is new? What is different? I think these things are always up for grabs. But you're right. There's definitely there's a sense that there are There are all kinds of political developments that can change things. I know that Lula is now back in Brazil. Lula believes in BRICS. So you could see, and BRICS also is not the same BRICS. It's now Modi and Putin. And then you kind of have South Africa and Brazil. So and then they want to bring in a bunch of other countries into a reconfigured BRICS. I think Algeria, a few other countries to join. So that's where the change might develop from. The thing with China is the China story has sort of stalled. Everybody thought that China was going to start having not the upper hand in the relationship with Africa over what the US had, what the EU had. But now China said China's stalling on the repayment of loans. So that's now changing also the game again with China.
I think that's so interesting. And I want to remind our audience who we're talking about. You know, you have a beautiful site. I've so enjoyed reading it. Africa is a country that talks about politics and culture, all the things we have addressed in our talk so far today. And also I want to mention it's a Creative Commons license. So any student of mine is going to be able to read that and use that in their student newspaper. But one of the things that strikes me is this idea, and I want to remind our audience that 70% of the population of the continent is under 30. In fact, the median age is 19.7%, the latest UN figures. 43% are urban. If you are looking at those figures as someone wanting to run for office or create a business, wow, target market, hello, young people in urban areas, I would say that everybody on the planet wants to be part of that. And I want to make sure we tell that story, because I think, you know, maybe they didn't get their candidate in Nigeria, but it is the youth vote, and you're also mentioning it, that is changing what is demanded of political leadership, what is demanded of government, what is demanded of civil society, and also in terms of business. So my background, I come from Forbes, where I covered billionaires, where I covered Nigeria, where I covered Dangote, who happens to be the richest African currently. And currently there are known billionaires from the African continent, 46. And I say known because a lot is unknown. You mentioned the Pandora Papers. But I think it's important to understand this urbanization for our audience and this private wealth that is being generated, because sometimes, so often, we don't hear that story. And I think for us in the US, for marketers, for politicians looking at Africa, there's, I think, huge potential. Again, you know, looking forward in the next decade, I see as a huge decade of change. What do you think? Am I being too Pollyanna-ish?
Not necessarily, but I'm going to get into the politics forever too. I think this week I saw that NBC Universal, that they signing a deal with what's known as MultiChoice. It's a South African company that basically dominates satellite broadcasting in the rest of the continent, entertainment, sports, etc. And they had their own streaming service called Showmax, which you could, that's kind of the equivalent of like a Hulu or something. And they just signed a deal with NBC Universal that Peacock's, their streaming service, Peacock, the people which is a US based, the people in Africa can get access to that content, HBO, etc. Now, when I read the story, I think in the Hollywood Reporter, it said something like the African market, so everybody knows now that there's money there. And if you just Google on YouTube, if you search on YouTube, Google is now a verb, but if you search on YouTube, you'll see, I mean, if you just type in something like Afrochella, which just happened in Ghana, where you have every Christmas, you now have plane loads of the children of the diaspora. In other words, their parents migrated to Western Europe and the United States or North America. They come back for this sort of like almost month-long jamboree of like hanging out in Ghana, going to parties, spending their money, investing. It's become so there's money. This is true. I just wrote a blog post the other day for the London Review of Books about the murder of a South African rap star, AKA, where he's top of the charge in South Africa. But the interesting part of his story was at his memorial service, what became clear that there was this whole new generation of Black South Africans who all went to private schools and who are making money because the sort of general take is like, you're accumulating wealth through the state. And if you're not accumulating wealth through the state, you're accumulating it like Dangote or Motsepe in South Africa, mining, manufacturing, etc. No, they're doing it. It's entertainment. It's what do you call it? The service industry. So there's a whole class of people, computing, programming. I mean, I think I saw a story a while back. Apple, Microsoft wanting to go to Nigeria. Facebook's putting up a huge office in Kenya. So yeah, they hold young people as a phenomena. That is definitely, and you're right, it's a growing market. They're connected to the rest of the world. They fly, it's a kind of cosmopolitan class. At the same time, I think the Nigerian elections again shows you that there's a difference between politics on social media and kind of actual. So a lot of the complaints after elections like we got robbed. But there's been articles that basically shows you the turnout was something like 29% of registered voters. So less than a third of registered voters turned up. And Tinubu, I think he won with like something like not high 30s of that vote, of that registered vote. So this idea that before the election, all you got was this impression that there was this like, Obi was riding the wave of something called the Obedience, I mean, what a name, and that they were going to turn up at the polls, change Nigerian elections, because there's this echo chamber of like Twitter, that social media, but they didn't register to vote. They didn't turn up to vote. I would venture to say I think that's what happened in South Africa also. Fees must fall, roads must fall. Fundamentally, I think challenged the political deal of 1994 and questioned how that political deal came about, its consequences for generations after that you couldn't really change the economy, that you had to, in a country that's racially unequal, that has this legacy, that you could not do it because you had set certain rules in place, right? And they said, we need to change this. And if the government is serious, if we want to de-racialize the education, we have to provide free higher education, we can afford it, etc. But then when that was over, the talk was like, will they turn that into some kind of an electoral base or something? And I could just, as an aside, mention what happened in Chile. The people in government in Chile now, they were leading those protests about a decade ago about education. So that did not happen in South Africa. And so I love the energy of youth. Like, I think we were young ones. So like there's the thing about being young, but it also ends. Like the whole thing with the university students were, in South Africa, once Fees Must Fall was over, some of them graduated and moved on to another phase in their life. Some people keep doing this stuff and remain politically engaged, but I think it often happens that people end up doing something else. And in some countries, unfortunately, the political establishment is so entrenched that you can, if you think of something like Uganda, where Museveni, basically, if you closely look at Ugandan politics, and some of the people who've written on our website on Africa's Country will argue this, that for some Ugandans, the presidency and Museveni, that they don't debate that. That's just sort of like, okay, that's just there. But what you can change is you can change who becomes members of parliament. You can change like you could like, what's his name? Bobby Wine. You could become an MP and you could change politics through the electoral system. And in some instances, in the ruling party, the NRM in Uganda, you have basically competitive primaries. That is essentially like the general election already, because it's like, and then there's an NRM, which is the ruling party, but there's also an NRM independent that sits in parliament, that caucuses that publicly caucuses against the party, but they're members of the same party. So there's lots of little maneuvers that people are doing. I don't know. I don't know if I answered, if I arrive at a conclusion here. I don't know what my conclusion. Yeah, I think I probably made it more difficult. I don't know.
Well, I think the conclusion is that we need to watch Africa more closely. because changes are happening. Nick, did you?
Well, no, I just was struck by, you know, what happened in many countries in Africa also happens here. The question of the youth energy that doesn't translate into people actually turning up at the polls, and therefore, and the echo, and as you also said, the echo chamber of social media skewing the on-the-ground politics. So in that sense, I think there are trends in both the United States and then in many sub-Saharan African states that you could see the parallel. But I wanted to, you were mentioning about the diaspora, and you had this example of the Ghanaian diaspora returning during the holiday season, and that got me thinking about what we have seen with other countries where a diaspora returns and really jumpstarts the economy, develops ties, whether, you know, we saw with Ireland or Estonia or India, where you have immigration, and then the children decide that they're going to bridge back and forth. Are we seeing something similar in places like Ghana, other countries in West Africa that have large professional diasporas in the United States, sort of saying we're going to go back, we're going to build these business ties, these other ties, and is there a sense too about how the diaspora is received when it comes back? Because as again from the Eastern European experience, we have seen that sometimes diasporas are welcomed, and in other cases they're not welcome. The children and grandchildren are essentially, you left and we don't want you back. Is there anything we can draw yet? Will we be talking about a Ghanaian economic miracle the way we talked about Ireland with a diaspora that came back and returned and invested and paved the way for, you know, Ireland's remarkable jump in the 1980s and the 1990s? Are we seeing any trends like that where the diaspora comes back and integrates the old country with whatever, you know, whether it's the United States or whatever the new country is?
I mean, before I answer that, I just want to make clear so people who listen don't think that I said the only reason Obi did not win was because young people didn't register. You know, it's that, like you said, it's the Twitter versus real politics. There was also widespread, what people, a lot of they call them the monitoring organizations called voting irregularities.
Irregularities. Yeah.
The people had don't much trust in the Independent Electoral Commission of Nigeria. There was voter intimidation. Like I did read about people being attacked by thugs who belong to one party and say to people, you can't vote for other candidates, and then kind of trying to beat them up. And of course, there was widespread vote buying. In this Nigeria, like it's like a cliche, but it's politics. There is a lot of cash. Like I think I read something like the primaries for the presidential candidates in the two big parties were like the way people say, like, you spend money on a campaign for president, the amount of money that was spent just to become the candidate there was quite astronomical. So to your question then about the diaspora, there's multiple ways I think that this is playing out, and I'll give the one that I think is the most interesting in a formal sense. So there was some scholarship in political science. I remember when I got my first job, I did at Michigan, and I did a dissertation defense, and the student who was presenting, the PhD student, presented about something called the global nation state, which is this idea that the diaspora actually has a say in national politics with a seat or seats in the national legislature. The presidential candidates actually actively go out to campaign in the diaspora. I think Mexico does it, Poland does that. So in Africa, at that time, and of course, this has been updated since then, I'm assuming, but I know Senegal does that. Senegal has a formal process by which the large diasporas in the east coast of the U.S., Western Europe, they have some representation national parliament. Now the model there, of course, which I don't want to get too deep in the woods, but we know that this is, France did this with the departments and within their sort of, weird colonial system. They had representation for people from Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire to sit in the assembly, right? So it's not a totally new thing, but I think it's an interesting development in these kind of post-colonial states. So Senegal has it, I think Cape Verde has it. And it means that it's an equal understanding about the role of the diaspora. It's not like sort of they have money, they have influence. It's not that level, but it's more they have a direct say in politics. In other instances, you have people in the diaspora who are very successful, who then return. Often they run for office. So like I think that was the case in Gabon, not in Gabon, in Togo, but one of the countries in West Africa. Somebody ran like that. In Congo, that was the case, but he lost the election. Actually, the rumor was that he had won, but he unfortunately lost the election. So that does happen. I think the second version of this is, of course, you've referred to the Ghanaian example. The Ghanaian example is slightly more complex because year of return, which is supposed to be 400 years since slavery, that was the policy of the incumbent government, promoting this idea of people should come back because Ghana has a lot of slave fort, which they preserve. So if visitors come from the diaspora, they make that part of the trip. There's also attempts to people who feel sort of alienated, discriminated again in the West, so they go back there to affirm themselves. So this, there's sort of an official government investment in this kind of program. But if you read media accounts of this, so there's two things. One is Ghana is going through an economic crisis where it's looking for a bailout from the IMF. The economic governance is kind of dismal. The president is highly unpopular. And so a lot of the debate in Ghana is that this is a sort of diversion politics. You want to make us focus on these people who come here every Christmas so that we don't focus on the inequalities that they're experiencing. And I think the other point that people often make is that it creates a kind of parallel economy, which is even more inaccessible to local people. Like it sets up, like new restaurants, hotels that are very expensive, and local people cannot enjoy any of this. So the consequence is, while it sounds like a great idea, in this instance, in this kind of instance where it's not formalized, but it's formalized at the level of like, this is a sort of broad government policy, and people are just coming and going, and it creates, like it does in Portugal with the housing thing, it creates pressure on the housing market, it makes things more unaffordable. So it often plays out like that. But in general, my sense is, and I mean, I'm also like an immigrant, if you want, living in New York City. I think it depends on the country. South Africa doesn't, I mean, in my own case, South Africa doesn't have a long history of immigration by Black South Africans in particular. White South Africans, there's a long kind of history to the UK, New Zealand, Australia. There's a lot of like connections, even during apartheid. Black South Africans, unless they went into political exile, they were politically involved, or they went to study, they left. But in most cases, they would return. Because South Africa is a relatively wealthy country, even though now it's going to crisis on electricity and so on. But it doesn't have that same kind of history. So it does depend on what country, where you are and what country you're in. But I think the two main responses to your point is mostly this kind of very formal political process that then, I think that seems to be the best model. And then this sort of arbitrary model, which is often tied to one or other administration. So it's not a national program. It's a program that people associate with a particular political party, political orientation. And I think when that party goes out of power, that ends. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
I'd like to take us back to my first question on how the media covers Africa and ask you, aside from Africa as a country, which I think is a fabulous site that everybody needs to read, who else is covering Africa in a thoughtful, insightful way that we can tell our audience? Because this is what we're trying to do here at the Doorstep, is make sure we connect global issues to domestic concerns. what do you read? What would you recommend for our audience?
My general answer is, I actually think the media is covering Africa better. And I'll say this, well, Western media, and I'm talking also of like, well, two things. One is there's a kind of the establishment media, the ones with, that spends resources, the kind of elite media, the ones that sets public agenda that's read by elites. I think that media, over time, they're doing a better job. There's a really good study by Toussaint Motias, who's at Stanford University. And he actually, I think he did a great study of how many of the sort of very crude stereotypes that we used to associate with coverage of Africa in the West, the ones that Binyavanga Wainaina complained about in How to Write About Africa, and the ones that Africa as a country used to write about in its initial stages, much of that doesn't exist anymore. And there are reasons for that. One is that in some instances, Western publications, they've employed Africans as correspondents. So the New York Times' East Africa correspondent is actually of Somali, Kenyan origin. So that's an interesting, the bureau chief there's, so that changes. There's also in South Africa, I know they use some South African reporters as part of their team. So if they report a story, you'll see the name of the foreign correspondent working with a local reporter. They also, in the sort of the media around their reporting, they'll put those people also near the front. So the role of the foreign correspondent has changed. You just don't write anymore for your audience back home. You're also now writing, your story goes out on the internet. So the people you're writing about, they reading it also. So there's many, I'm sort of just getting to, pointing out to many of the factors that I think has improved the coverage. So in general, I think that the coverage has gotten better. And I'm talking here, as I said, about sort of elite media with lots of resources, New York Times, Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal does really great coverage on Africa. I think people sleep on them, they're really good. Foreign policy, foreign affairs. Many of these older publications that people wouldn't have read on African affairs, I think now they're doing much better. This is why you might also notice Africa as a country writes more opinion and analysis that often has, if we write a story now about Nigeria, we're writing about like, hey, what just happened here, rather than, oh, how is this covered by the New York Times? Right. So I think that the coverage have improved. There's a lot of great, and we know many of those reporters through our work with Africa's country, they've done better. And so I'm pleased with what I'm seeing. I think next to that, there's also been a lot of podcasts coming out. And I can recommend a number, like these sort of run by academics, or some of them are located on the platforms of news organizations. So if you go to something like foreign policy, of course, but if you go to like Times Live, which is a South African publication, News 24, there's also one that we're partnered with called the Nigerian Scam. They out of Lagos. I would really recommend them. One of them is actually a contributing editor of Africa's Country, Saeed Husseini, who's a political scientist. So I think there's a kind of the podcast world. And if people tweet at me, I'm happy to just kind of if I'm pushed, I'll make a list if people are interested.
Yeah.
YouTube is also interesting. This kind of somebody who says, who's like traveling somewhere and makes a diary of something. Some of it is like, oh, look at me just eating food. Others are somebody walking into neighborhoods and just speaking to people, and you get a very different view. I also read other languages, so I can read Dutch, I can read a little bit of German, and I think sometimes there is in those and Google Translate is also your friend. I would like that. So the AI translators. So there's I think the diversity of media that people can access about Africa, it's not the same as when I started Africa's Country in 2009. It's a much better world. Twitter, Facebook, people form, you can form your own, what do you call it, like a discussion group or whatever. And through that, you can get all kinds of different articles. I think that the environment for media has improved from my vantage point.
I am always talking about the power of social media, so I totally agree. And on our question. You know, Doorstep, we do book talks, and I want to know what is on your nightstand. What are you reading right now for our audience?
That is a good question. I'm currently, maybe because I have to write something about it, but I'm obsessed with the 1970s and in Africa, particularly in West Africa. I'm sort of, I have to write something about Fela Kuti, and I decided that I'm not going to write about Fela Kuti, the usual, you know, Fela Kuti made some music, had 29 wives, you know, this sort of walked around in these with no clothes on. And it's like, no, actually, what I think is interesting is Fela Kuti's most productive period as a musician and as a social critic coincides with a very interesting moment in Nigeria, in which there were lots of debates about Nigeria's political system, its state, that it had to deliver substantive goods to its people. And so there were these, mostly from the left in Nigeria, there's a university called Ahmadu Bello, and there were many professors from there who actually, the government started taking advice from them. And at the end of the 80s, when Fela was sort of tapering off, remember he got AIDS in the end, but at that point, the then military ruler, Babangida, he called for a commission, like a public commission, where he asked these academics to write up a report, a proposal, if you want, for what kind of Nigeria would you like to see here? Now, when they sent him the report saying we want more public investment, we want more accountability, we fired all of them, etc. You know, but the point is just like, I'm obsessed currently with articles and books and so on about that period. And of course, I read a lot about South Africa. I'm always reading books about South Africa.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for those recommendations and for a lovely discussion today, and happy International Women's Day.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, visit carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.